The wind came up the bench an hour before dawn and found her already on her knees in the fourth row, the short spade biting cold into ground that had been forbidden to her for a month. She had counted the rows in the dark the way the old man had taught her to count anything that mattered, by touch and not by eye. Her bare hand walking trunk to trunk along the planted apple stalks, until the bark changed under her fingers and told her she had passed where the agent said the orchard ended. He had stood at this exact place and pointed with his whole arm and named the third row, the boundary of what was sound and what was poisoned. She had nodded, then she was not nodding now. The lantern sat hooded at her hip, so the light would not carry to the road, and the dirt she lifted was the wrong color, too dark and too loose for a hillside that had gone 4 years without rain, and the wrongness of it was the first true thing the place had ever told her. She did not stop to wonder long. Wondering was a luxury, and she had spent the last of her money, 2 weeks past. Her name was Tabitha Orr, and she had come to the Sabinal Bench in the New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1879 with a freight ticket, a dead man's tools, and $4 folded into the lining of her glove. She was 28 years old, narrow through the shoulders, with hands that were already older than the rest of her from a trade most men would not have let a woman near. She dug. She read ground for water and for fill, for what had been buried and what had only settled, and she had learned it not in any school, but at the elbow of Silas Voss, who had dug wells and graves and cellars across 2 territories for 40 years. He had died the winter before in a bunk that smelled of liniment and pipe smoke, and the last thing he gave her was not money, because he had none but a sentence. The ground keeps an honest record, he had said, his voice gone to gravel. It is the only witness that cannot be paid to lie. She had not understood it as a gift then. She was beginning to. The orchard had come to her cheap because no one else would touch it. That was the whole of its appeal and the whole of its danger, and she had known both when she signed. Let me say plainly, before the work of this gets heavy, that the people who pass a thing by are not always fools, and the people who buy it are not always wise. Sometimes the cheap thing is cheap because it is cursed by drought and debt and the long memory of a town, and the patient hand that takes it ends up with nothing but blisters and a grave on a windy bench. Tabitha did not know yet which kind of buyer she was. She only knew that the price had been $40 for 11 acres of terraced hillside and 120 apple stalks planted in 5 neat rows by a man who did not farm, and that a thing arranged that carefully by someone who did not love it was a thing worth understanding. The man who had arranged it was named Erat Calhoun, and he held the title of land agent for the Sabinal Bench Improvement Company, which was a grand name for one office above a shuttered bank in the dead town of Halloran's Reach. Calhoun was a tall man gone soft at the middle, with pale eyes and a habit of smiling before he said the hard thing, and he had ridden up to her claim 3 days after she took possession to be neighborly, he said, and to give her the lay of the land. He walked her down the terraces with his thumbs in his vest and named the rows for her. The first 3 were sound, he told her, planted in good fill the company had hauled up after the flood of '74 scoured the bench. The 4th and 5th he had planted himself over old ground, and that old ground was sour, with lye and lime from a tannery pit the original settlers had dug and abandoned. Lye-burn soil would kill a stock in a season and sicken anyone who breathed the dust of it turned up. Keep your spade above the 3rd row, and you will come to no harm, he told her, smiling. There is nothing under the 4th and the 5th but poison, and I would not have a young woman new to the territory take sick on my conscience. She had thanked him. She had meant it at the time. A warning given for free is worth at least the listening. What troubled her came later, and it came slowly, the way the best troubles do. She had spent her first 2 weeks doing the only thing she knew how to do, which was to read the ground before she trusted it. She walked every terrace at every hour, mornings when the dew showed where water pooled and where it ran, evenings when the low light threw the gentle swales of old digging into relief. Silas had taught her that disturbed earth never lies flat again, not truly, not for 50 years, that a man can rake a grave smooth and a winter can settle it, and still the trained eye will catch the long, soft dimple where the ground was opened and filled. And the 4th and 5th rows, where Calhoun had said the poisoned tannery pit lay, did not read like a pit at all. A tannery pit was a hole, a single sour wound in the hillside. What she saw under the 4th and 5th rows was rows of dimples, regular ones, 6 feet long and 3 feet wide and spaced as evenly as the apple stalks above them, as if someone had dug a great many narrow holes in a tidy line and filled them all in the same season, and planted a screen of young trees on top of the lie. She knew what a row of 6-foot holes looked like. She had helped Silas dig 40 of them in her years at his side. The knowledge sat in her stomach like a swallowed stone, and she said nothing to anyone, because a woman new to a place who starts naming what is under the ground is a woman who gets run off it. So she had waited and watched, and let Calhoun believe she was an obedient buyer, tending her 3 sound rows. And on the cold morning this account opens, with her money gone and her patience spent, and the certainty grown too large to carry quietly, she went down into the dark and began to dig where she had been told the poison was. The spade found the first hard thing at a depth of 3 feet, and it was not lye-burned dirt, and it was not a tannery pit. It was wood. She cleared it with her hands. Pine boards, rough sawn, laid flat and already going soft at the edges with rot. The way buried wood goes when it has been in damp ground a handful of years and not a single one. She worked her fingers down along the grain until she found the gap where 2 boards met, set the flat of the pry bar into it, and leaned her whole narrow weight onto the iron the way Silas had shown her, patient, not greedy, letting the wood give in its own time rather than splitting it. The nail heads wept rust down the boards in long brown streaks. She pried a board loose, and the smell came up at her, the particular sealed cold earth smell of air that had been shut away from the living world, the smell of a thing closed in 74, breathing out at last into 1879, and under the board was not a body, which was the thing she had braced herself for. Under the board was a cavity lined in tin, the seams of the tin folded and crimped by a careful hand against the wet, and in the cavity, packed in straw gone black and matted, were ledgers, account books. 6 of them bound in marbled board with leather spines, the corners knocked soft with handling before they were ever buried, kind a company keeps and the kind a company is careful to be seen burning when it wants a thing forgotten. She lifted the top one, and the straw clung to it, and the weight of it in her 2 hands was the weight of a thing meant never to be lifted again. She sat back on her heels in the bottom of the hole, with the first ledger in her lap and the false dawn coming gray over the rim, and she understood that she had bought, for $40, the one thing on the Savinol bench that Calhoun could not afford to have read. She did not open it there. The light was wrong, and her hands were filthy and cold, and Silas had taught her that you do not handle the evidence of a thing in the field, where you might lose a page to the wind. She wrapped the ledger in her shawl, climbed out of the hole, and stood a moment looking down the terraces toward the dead town where one lamp burned in the agent's window, even at that hour. Then she filled the top of the hole loose scattered leaf litter over it, the way she had seen Silas hide a fresh wellhead from a thieving neighbor, and walked back up to the line shack she slept in with the company's secret cold against her ribs. It would be easy to tell you that she read the ledgers and the truth fell out plain, and to hurry on to the reckoning. It did not happen that way. The ground may not be paid to lie, but a man's account books are written by the man, and Calhoun had been careful what the first ledger held, in a clerk's tidy hand, was the ordinary business of the improvement company across 9 years. Hauling charges, survey fees, filing costs for the Territorial Land Office. Page after page of small, honest sums, the kind of bookkeeping a company keeps to show an auditor if one ever climbed the bench. And she nearly let herself believe she had dug up nothing but a buried set of duplicate books, hidden the way a careful man hides his spare copies against fire. She read by the line shack's single window through the whole of that first day, missing the work she should have done on her 3 sound rows, and by dusk her eyes ached and her faith in her own ground reading had thinned to a thread. Then she came to the back of the third ledger, to a section the clerk had not written, a section in a different hand, heavier and angrier. The downstrokes pressed so hard they had cut the page, and the heading on it was a list of names, 40 of them. Beside each name, a date in the year 74, the flood year. And beside each date, the same 2 words repeated 40 times down the column in that hard-pressing hand: removed. She knew now what the 6-foot holes had been. She had been right, and she had hoped to be wrong. I will not pretend to you that she wept, because she did not. She was not a woman the territory had left much weeping in. She set the ledger down very carefully, and she went outside into the cold and stood among the apple stalks Calhoun had planted as a lid over the thing, and she made herself say the names out loud, one at a time into the wind, because someone owed them that and she was the only one left who could pay it. It took a long while. There were 40. The flood of 74 was a true thing, and everyone on the bench knew the shape of it. The Sabinal had come over its banks in a spring melt and scoured the lower town of Halloran's Reach and drowned a great many head of stock and washed out the original settlers, a community of families who had filed honest claims on the bench in the late 60s and proved them up with their own hand. After the flood, the survivors were scattered and ruined, and the Sabinal Bench Improvement Company had risen up in the same year to buy their wrecked claims for pennies and resell the consolidated land to a railroad survey that never in the end came. That was the public story, and it was a sad common story, the kind the frontier produced by the hundred, and no one had ever thought to question it. What the back of the third ledger told, in that hard-cut hand, was that the flood had not done the work alone. The 40 names were the heads of the 40 settler families. The dates beside them were not death dates from the flood which had come in April. The dates ran from June through September, after the water was long gone. And the 2 words, removed and settled, were the words a company uses when it does not want to write down what it has actually done. The settler families had not been washed away. They had filed to rebuild, and the company had needed their claims clear, and so across one dry summer they had been removed. The graves under the 4th and 5th rows were not a tannery pit. They were the settlers, the 40 heads of household who would not sell, and Calhoun had planted apple trees over them and named the ground poison so that no one would ever turn it up. She understood, sitting in the cold with the name still in her mouth, why. He had warned her. He had not been protecting her. He had been protecting them, the dead, the way a man guards the one cellar in his house he can never let a guest into. And she understood, too, why he had warned her in particular, and not merely fenced the rows or fouled them in truth. He could not afford to draw a line that invited curiosity. He had needed a buyer too poor and too friendless to dig, and too grateful for a warning to ask why. He had looked at a narrow young woman with a dead man's tools and $4 in her glove, and seen exactly the buyer he wanted. He had been wrong about her in only one particular, but it was the particular that mattered. He had not known who taught her. You who are listening have likely guessed, before she let herself believe it, what kind of man would do such a thing and sleep. Hold that thought. The harder question is not what he did. It is how a woman with no money, no standing, and no friend on the bench was going to prove it against a man who owned the very office where proof was kept. Because that was the trap of it, and Tabitha saw the trap before she saw any way through. The ledgers in her shawl were evidence of nothing on their own. They were 6 account books, a woman dug out of a hillside, and the moment she carried them down to any authority, Calhoun would simply call them forgeries. She had buried herself, the spite of a failed buyer, and he would be believed because he was the company and she was a squatter with dirt under her nails. Worse than not believed. The instant he knew the books were out of the ground, the books would burn, and so would her line shack, and so very likely would she. Man who had cleared 40 heads of household off a hillside would not stumble over clearing one woman to keep it clear. She needed 3 things, and she made the list the way Silas had taught her, to make a list before a hard dig, naming each thing and what it would cost. She needed a living witness, someone who had seen the summer of '74 and could put a face and a memory beside the names in the ledger. She needed a way to make the proof public faster than Calhoun could destroy it, so that destroying it would only confirm it. And she needed to do both without Calhoun ever knowing she had opened the 4th row, until it was too late for the knowing to help him. The witness she found by accident, which is to say, by paying attention, which Silas had taught her, was the only kind of luck a poor person ever gets. There was an old man named Dorsey Kell, who lived alone in a dugout at the foot of the bench, and hauled water and split wood for the few souls still in Halloran's reach. A stooped, white-headed man with a bad hip and a habit of talking to his mule. The town treated him as part of the scenery. Tabitha had treated him as a man, which is to say, she had said good morning to him and meant it, and once had helped him lever his cart out of a rut without being asked. And old men remember who treats them as men. She went to him on a pretext of buying a load of stovewood, and she sat with him while he loaded it. And she let him talk, and when his talk circled near the flood, she did not steer it, and she did not flinch from it. And slowly, over 3 such visits across a week, the old man told her things he had carried alone for 5 years. He had driven a freight wagon for the company in '74. He had not known at first what he was hauling. By the end of that summer he had known, and he had kept driving because he was 60 and afraid, and a man who refuses such work disappears as easily as the work itself. He told her, the 3rd visit with his hands shaking on the mule's traces, that he had hauled lime up the bench all that summer, and had wondered why a company building an orchard needed so much lime, and that he had stopped wondering the day he understood. He told her where he named the 4th and 5th rows without her ever naming them first, and when he did, she knew she had her witness, and she knew what it had cost him to keep silent, and she did not make him say more than that. She said only, her voice quiet, that he had done what a frightened man does, and that it was not too late to do the other thing. Now he looked at her a long while. Then he said he had been waiting 5 years for someone to ask him in a way that did not feel like a noose, and he wiped his face with the back of his wrist and said he would say it again to anyone she liked, in front of God and the territory both. That was the alliance. It was not a grand thing. It was an old man and a young woman and a mule against a company. Silas had told her once that the strongest rope is not the thickest. It is the one with no rotten strand in it, and there was no rot in Kel. The second thing, the making of it public faster than it could be burned, was the harder problem, and it was the granddaughter who solved it. Her name was Junie Marsh, and she was the only descendant of the drowned settlers still anywhere near the bench, a sharp-eyed young woman of perhaps 20, who kept a small printing operation in the larger town of Cedar Gap, 2 days' ride down the valley, where she set type for handbills and a 4-page weekly that served the ranches strung along the lower Sabino. Her grandfather's name, Tabitha had found, was the 11th name in the ledger's hard column. Junie had grown up on the story that the flood took her family's claim, and she had grown up not quite believing it, the way the children of the dispossessed often carry a doubt they cannot name. When Tabitha rode the 2 days down to Cedar Gap and laid the third ledger open on the typestone and set her finger beside the 11th name and the date in August and the 2 cut-in words, the young printer went very still and then very white, and then, after a long moment, very calm. The way a person goes calm when a doubt they have carried all their life is finally given a shape they can act against. Junie understood the press in a way Tabitha could not, and she understood the trap as quickly as Tabitha had. One handbill, she said, could be torn down. One accusation could be denied. A thing set in type and run off in numbers, though, and scattered across a valley in a single night could not be unprinted, and a company that burned one woman's ledgers to silence her would find it had burned them too late, because by then the names would be in 200 kitchens between Cedar Gap and the territorial seat. She would not print the accusation. An accusation could be sued into silence. She would print the names. Just the 40 names, and the dates, and the 2 words the company itself had written, removed, and settled, copied true from the company's own book, and let the valley do the asking. A list of names is not a libel, she said. It is a roll of the dead, and no court in the territory would punish a granddaughter for printing the names of the drowned. They worked 3 nights in the back of the print shop with the windows papered over. Tabitha read the hard column aloud, and Junie set the type, name by name, and Kel sat in the corner on a stool, and confirmed each one he had known, which was more than half of them, and twice he stopped them to correct a Christian name that the clerk had gotten wrong because he had known the man and the company had not really. By the 3rd night the form was locked, and the names were in lead, 40 of them, and below them a single line that was not an accusation but a question, the only sentence in the whole sheet that was not copied straight from Calhoun's book. Junie said at last, "These rest beneath the 4th and 5th rows of the orchard on the Sabinal bench. Ask the company why. Now I will tell you the part that the gravest of such stories usually skips, and the part that mattered most, which is that Calhoun was not a fool and did not sit still. He had built his life on the careful management of what people were allowed to know, and a man like that has eyes. He learned, the way such men learn, that the new woman on the bench had been seen riding south twice, and that she had been asking the old water hauler about the flood year, and that she had visited the printer in Cedar Gap, whose family name he had reason to remember. He did not know what was in the ground, had come out of the ground. He knew the shape of a thing closing on him, even so. And he moved to close it first. He moved against the witness, because the witness was the weakest strand and the one he could reach. Kel came back to his dugout at the foot of the bench on the 4th evening to find that the company had called in a debt the old man had not known he carried, a freight account, 9 years stale, and that a deputy from the territorial seat, the one titled man in this whole account, had ridden up with a paper ordering Kel off the company's land within the week, the dugout itself standing on a corner of the consolidated claim. It was a legal thing, clean and cruel, and it would put a man of 65 on the road with a mule and a cart before the snow, and everyone on the bench understood it for exactly what it was, which was a warning and a way to make the witness a vagrant whose word no court would weigh. This was the low place. Tabitha rode up from Cedar Gap to find the old man sitting on his cart, with everything he owned roped behind him and his face set toward leaving. And for a long hour it seemed the whole thing would come apart, because a frightened man who has been frightened once before is hard to hold to a hard course, and Kell had been here before, and had chosen to drive the wagon. He told her he would not testify now. He told her the company would have him on the road and dead by spring, and what good was an old man's word against that? He did not look at her while he said it. She did not argue. Silas had taught her that you do not argue a frightened man out of his fear. You give him something heavier than the fear to hold. So she climbed up on the cart beside him, and she told him the truth, which was that the names were already in lead 2 days south, that the thing was already out of his hands and hers both, that the company could put him on the road but could not unprint 40 dead men, and that the only question left to him was whether, when the valley asked who had hauled the lime and lived to say so, the answer would be a man who finally spoke or a man who ran a second time and carried the silence to his grave. She did not raise her voice. She named what it would cost him either way, the road and the cold against the standing and the danger, and she let him choose. The old man sat a long time with the reins slack in his hands. Then he climbed down off the cart, and he unroped his goods, and he carried them back inside the dugout one load at a time, his bad hip and all, and that was his answer. The proof Calhoun moved to destroy he could not reach, and this is the hinge of it, the thing that turned the law. He had guessed by now that the buried books were the danger, and he did the thing a careful, guilty man does, which is to protect himself by destroying the evidence. On the 5th night, he had 2 of his men go up the bench and burn out the line shack where the new woman slept, expecting to take the books with it. They burned it clean to the sill stones. The books were not in the shack, though, and had not been for a week. 3 of them were locked in the typestone room in Cedar Gap. 2 were buried again by Tabitha's own hands in a place only she knew, the way Silas had taught her to never keep all of a thing in one hole. And the 6th, the 3rd ledger, the one with the hard-cut column of names, was in a flour sack under the seat of Dorsey Kell's cart, the very cart the company had tried to put on the road, which meant that when Calhoun's men burned the shack to destroy the evidence, they had in the same week handed the most damning ledger a free ride past their own checkpoints in the possession of the man they had ordered to leave. The company's own cruelty had carried the proof out of its reach. A man who guards a thing by driving its keeper away has not guarded it. He has delivered it. Tabitha stood on the warm ash of her burned shack the next morning and felt no fear, which surprised her, and she understood the absence of it. Fear is for a thing that might still go either way. This was decided. It had been decided the night the type was locked, and the burning only proved that Calhoun knew it too, and a thing your enemy is already trying to destroy is a thing you have already won. She gathered her tools, which were Silas's tools, the long spade and the short and the iron pry bar, out of the cold ash, where they lay unburned, because iron does not burn, and she shouldered them and walked down to the dead town. Junie ran off 400 sheets in 2 nights and a day. They went out the way handbills go on the frontier, which is to say in saddlebags and freight wagons, and the pockets of riders who could not read them, but knew someone who could. And they went up the Sabinal and down it, into Cedar Gap, and the ranches in the territorial seat itself, 40 names and 2 dates in a line that only asked a question. And the valley did the thing Tabitha had trusted it to do, which was not to riot, because the frontier does not riot over the long dead. but to remember, slowly and then all at once, that the flood of '74 had taken the lower town in April, and that nobody had ever quite explained why the settler families had vanished in the dry months after. The question, once asked in lead, could not be unasked. Within a fortnight, a judge 200 miles east, who answered to no company on the Sabino bench, ordered the 4th and 5th rows opened under the eyes of the court. They did not let Calhoun's men dig. They sent for a person who knew how to open ground without destroying what it held, who could read a fill and lift a thing whole. And there was only one such person within 100 miles. And so it came to pass that Tabitha Orr went back down into the rows she had bought for $40, this time in daylight, with the territory watching, and opened them the way Silas had taught her to open the resting ground of the dead, which is slowly, and with respect, and without ever once driving the spade through the thing you have come to recover. It took 11 days. She would not be hurried, and the court did not hurry her. She opened the holes one at a time, in order, the way they had been dug, working on her knees with the short spade, and then with a wooden trowel, and then with her bare hands, as she neared what each hole held, brushing the fill away a palmful at a time so that nothing was broken that did not have to break. Beside each one, she set a stake of peeled willow. The mornings were cold enough that her breath hung over the open ground, and the men of the court stood back at the edge of the terrace with their hats off, and no one spoke while she worked, and the only sounds were the spade and the wind and the bare apple stalks, and now and again the soft fall of dirt off the side of a hole. As each was confirmed, Junie wrote the name that matched the row against the company's own column, her pencil steady, though her face was not, and Kell, who had known so many of them, named them again aloud as they came up, his cracked old voice going carefully over each Christian name as though calling. In the end, that no paper could answer. There was no violence in it. There was no confession wrung from the agent in a final scene, because the agent was never given a final scene. By the time the third of the 40 was confirmed, Calhoun had ridden out of Halloran's Reach in the night and did not stop, and the title of land agent for a company that no longer had a single buyer or friend on the bench went with him into a distance. The account does not follow, and that is the only interior of his this story will ever enter. He had built a life on the certainty that the ground keeps no record a man cannot bury deep enough. He had learned somewhere on the road that he was wrong, and that a young woman with the wrong inheritance had proven it, and the knowing of it was punishment enough, and the story does not owe him more. The settler families were not made whole, because the dead are never made whole, and Tabitha did not pretend otherwise. The consolidated claim was broken in the courts even so, and the land was returned in pieces to the descendants who could be found, and Junie proved up her grandfather's old filing in her own name, the 11th name, in the column made a living title again. The 40 were lifted from the rows where they had been hidden and laid in proper ground on the high shoulder of the bench, in a row of their own. This time a true row, with their names cut into cottonwood that Tabitha set herself deep, the way you set a thing meant to outlast you. She did not cut a marker for the company. She did not need to. The absence of one said everything that needed saying. She kept the orchard. That surprised the few who knew her, who had thought she would want nothing more to do with the bench. But she had not come to the territory to run from hard ground, and the apple stalks Calhoun had planted as a lid over the dead were, whatever their purpose, real trees, and a real tree does not know the use a wicked man intended it for. She tended them. The 4th and 5th rows she did not replant, out of respect, and left to grass, and the dead were moved up to their high row. But the first 3 she kept, and pruned, and watered from the well she dug herself that second summer, down 40 feet to good water, on a line Silas had taught her to read in the Lay of the Swales. It is a strange thing, and she thought about it often, that the man had told her the truth in a way. There was poison past the third row. It simply was not in the soil. And he had been right, that she should not dig there, if his meaning had been that she should not learn what he had done, and he had been more right than he knew, that the wrong young woman digging in the wrong row would be the end of him. He had only misjudged which young woman, and what she carried in her hands, and who had put it there. Silas Voss had been dead a year by the autumn. The rows were closed, and Tabitha thought of him on the day she set the last marker, the way you think of the dead when you have finally understood a thing they tried to give you. The ground keeps an honest record, he had said. She had taken it that winter in the liniment-smelling bunk, for an old digger's grim joke about the work. She understood now that it had been the whole of his estate, the only thing he had to leave her, and that it was worth more than the $40 and the $4 in her glove, and everything she would ever earn with her spade. He had left her a way of looking at the world. It had been enough to undo a company. There is a thing she did. The last autumn this account follows that I will leave you with, because it is the truest picture of her I have. She finished the high row of cottonwood markers on a cold, bright afternoon, with the wind coming up the bench the way it had the morning she first dug past the third row. And when the last name was cut, she did not stand back to admire it, and she did not speak. She knelt, and she took up a handful of the good dark earth from beside the new graves, and she rubbed it slow between her palms the way Silas had taught her to test a fill for its honesty, feeling for the truth in it. Then she let it fall, and she picked up the long spade with the worn ash handle that had been his, and she walked back down the terraces to the well she had dug, where there was water now, where everyone had sworn there was none. And she drew a bucket, and she watered her 3 sound rows in the failing light, 1 tree at a time, the way you tend a living thing you mean to keep. Before I let the wind close over this, let me leave you the one question, the whole of it left in me, which is, whether you have ever been warned away from a thing by someone who claimed to be protecting you and wondered, later, who they were truly protecting. If a story has stayed with you the way this one stayed with me, there are others of its kind near at hand. For tonight, though, hold the picture of the woman on the bench, alone in the cold light, with a spade that was not hers, and a record that could not be bought, watering trees a dead man would never see over ground. The wind came up the bench, and the light went gold, and then it went, and she worked on, until it was too dark to see the rows, and then she stopped, because the ground had given up everything it had to give, and there was nothing left to do but live on it, honestly, which she did for a long time and well.